When Roman legions marched into a kingdom, the sound of war was not the most terrifying thing that followed them. Silence was, because silence meant the fighting was over. And what came next was not battle, but judgment without mercy. For a queen, that moment did not arrive with a sword strike. It arrived with footsteps on palace marble, heavy, controlled, unhurried. Roman soldiers did not rush when they had already won. They moved like men who knew the outcome was no longer in question. And in that final hour inside the palace walls, something far more unsettling than destruction unfolded. A ruler who only moments ago was surrounded by servants, advisors, and the illusion of divine protection now suddenly found herself standing in a shrinking world. The banners outside no longer represented her. The gates no longer obeyed her. Even the air inside her throne room felt different, as if the space itself had begun to forget her name. Then the doors opened, not broken down in rage, but opened with discipline, and the first Roman soldier stepped in, not to meet a queen, but to confirm the end of one. In that instant, everything changed shape. A crown was no longer a symbol of authority. It became something ornamental, almost irrelevant. The throne was no longer a seat of power. It was just furniture inside a conquered building. And the queen herself, once addressed with titles that made nations bow, was now measured through Roman eyes that recognized only one truth: ownership had changed. What makes this moment so disturbing is not what Rome did in battle, but how calmly it turned living rulers into evidence. Evidence that resistance had existed, and evidence that it had already been erased. Chapter 1. The moment a kingdom breaks. What makes the Roman moment of conquest so disturbing is not simply that a kingdom falls, but that it falls all at once, without the slow adjustments that usually accompany the end of power in modern imagination. There is no gradual fading, no structured handover, no diplomatic cushioning of reality. Instead, there is a sudden fracture in time itself, where everything that was once stable becomes instantly obsolete the moment Roman standards are raised inside the city walls. Inside the palace, this shift was almost surreal. A queen could still be standing in the same hall where she had received ambassadors, judged disputes, and issued commands that shaped entire provinces, yet the meaning of that space had already changed before she even fully understood what had happened. The marble floors were the same, the pillars were the same, the throne still sat at the center like a silent witness, but none of it belonged to her anymore. It had already been mentally reassigned by force. Roman soldiers did not need to announce ownership in words. Their formation, their discipline, their presence alone rewrote the identity of the space. This is where Roman conquest becomes psychologically precise. Soldiers were not simply warriors, they were instruments of administrative takeover. Their movements were systematic. One group secured exits, another controlled weapons, another moved toward administrative rooms where records, seals, and royal decrees were kept. Because Rome understood something deeply strategic: to truly conquer a kingdom, you do not only defeat its army, you capture its ability to define itself, and that definition often lived in documents, symbols, and people who represented authority. For the queen, this created a collapse that was not just political, but existential. She was no longer interacting with an enemy that recognized her status. Instead, she was being processed by a system that had already decided her status was irrelevant. The most unsettling part was that no one needed to insult her, threaten her, or even acknowledge her emotionally. Indifference itself became the weapon. Roman soldiers did not look at her with hatred or admiration, they looked at her with operational focus. the same way they would assess any secured asset in a conquered zone. In that environment, identity begins to dissolve faster than resistance. A queen who once embodied sovereignty suddenly finds that every external confirmation of who she is has disappeared. Her guards are gone. Her advisors are silent or detained. Her commands no longer produce action. Even her name, when spoken, no longer triggers obedience, only recognition without consequence. This is a uniquely Roman form of dominance, not the destruction of the body, but the removal of response from the world around it. And once that response is gone, transformation begins almost automatically, because in Roman terms, a captured ruler does not remain a ruler in any functional sense. She becomes a classified subject of empire. Her value is no longer tied to authority, but to utility, whether as a political bargaining tool, a symbol for triumphal display, or a living reminder of Rome's absolute reach. The same person who once represented the peak of sovereignty is now reduced to a position inside an imperial framework that was designed long before her capture. That is the most unsettling truth of Roman conquest. It does not just end kingdoms. It absorbs them while the people who once ruled them are still alive to witness their own redefinition. Chapter 2, The Law That Erased Kings and Queens. What makes this legal system so chilling is not just what it allowed, but how completely it removed moral hesitation from conquest. In earlier tribal or rival kingdom warfare, the fate of captured rulers could still be shaped by custom, negotiation, or personal mercy. But Rome replaced uncertainty with structure. It did not ask what should be done with a defeated queen in emotional or moral terms. It asked what category she now belonged to inside a legal machine that had already been built long before her capture. And once she was placed inside that machine, her personal identity stopped being legally relevant. This is where ius gentium becomes more than just law. It becomes a framework that translates violence into administration. To Roman jurists and commanders, conquest was not an emotional event. It was a status change, a legal transformation of space, people, and authority. The queen was no longer a ruler who has been defeated. She was reclassified as someone who existed outside the protections that defined Roman civic life. That distinction mattered more than it appears at first glance, because in Rome, law was not symbolic, it was operational. It determined who could be punished and how, who could be restrained, who required formal process, and who did not. A Roman citizen, even in chains, still carried legal identity. That identity imposed limits on what could be done to them. Trials, procedures, and formal accusations still mattered, even in extreme cases. But a conquered foreign ruler existed outside that boundary entirely, and that exclusion created a second layer of vulnerability, one that was not driven by emotion or hatred, but by permission. Anything that happened to her was no longer considered a violation of law in the Roman sense. It was considered the exercise of authority over conquered property. That is what made the system so structurally powerful. It absorbed action that would otherwise be crimes and redefined them as governance. Even the 12 tables, often viewed as the foundation of Roman legal order, reflect this separation between protected citizens and unprotected outsiders. The law was not designed to be universal. It was designed to stabilize Roman society first, and everything beyond that boundary existed in a different legal reality. Within that reality, war captives were not participants in legal rights. They were assets managed by the state after victory. And this is where the psychological transformation becomes most visible, because once a queen is placed into that category, her past, her lineage, her diplomacy, her authority no longer functions as protection. In fact, it becomes irrelevant data. Rome did not need to deny her greatness, it simply made it unusable. Her crown does not exempt her, her treaties do not shield her, her alliances do not matter. Legally, she has already been moved into a different system where status is not recognized, only classification. That shift is what turns conquest into something more permanent than destruction. Armies can be rebuilt, cities can be repaired, thrones can be reclaimed, but when law itself redefines a person as belonging to a different category of existence, the defeat is no longer temporary. It becomes structural. And in that structure, Rome did not just defeat queens in war. It absorbed them into a legal reality where defeat itself became permanent identity. Chapter 3. Capture. The moment identity collapses. What makes this stage of Roman conquest especially unsettling is how organized it was. Nothing about it was improvised or driven by rage. It was procedural, almost clinical in execution, as if the capture of a queen followed a set of instructions refined over generations of warfare. From the moment resistance collapsed, Roman soldiers shifted roles instantly. They were no longer simply fighters on a battlefield, they became handlers of a political asset. Their discipline mattered more than their aggression. A queen could not be treated like an ordinary prisoner because ordinary prisoners could be replaced or forgotten. A queen, however, carried symbolic weight. She represented legitimacy, continuity, and the identity of an entire kingdom, and Rome understood that controlling her meant controlling the narrative of the war itself. This is why the environment around her changed so abruptly. The battlefield noise might still be distant screams, clashing metal, collapsing structures, but within her immediate space, everything became tightly controlled. The soldiers surrounding her did not behave like conquerors in chaos. They behaved like guards in a secured corridor. Movements were coordinated. Distance was maintained. Escape routes were eliminated before they were even relevant. The objective was not confrontation, it was containment with precision, and within that containment, something far more damaging began to unfold: the removal of agency. A queen's authority does not exist only in her title, it exists in how the world responds to her presence. In her palace, a gesture could command action. A word could shift the behavior of generals. Even silence carried meaning because others interpreted it. But in Roman custody, that entire feedback loop disappeared. She could speak, but speech no longer triggered obedience. She could demand, but demand no longer produced results. The environment had been stripped of responsiveness. This is where psychological collapse begins, not through physical harm, but through the erosion of cause and effect. A ruler is defined by influence. When influence stops functioning, identity begins to fracture. The mind expects response and receives none. It expects recognition and encounters indifference. Over time, this disconnect creates a deeper realization. Authority has not just been taken away, it has become irrelevant in the surrounding system. Roman soldiers did not need to insult her or declare her fall. Their discipline already communicated it. The absence of ceremony, the absence of titles, and the absence of acknowledgement, all of it reinforced the same message without words. She was no longer operating within the framework of power. Even the act of movement reinforced this transition. She was no longer deciding where to go. She was being moved. Direction itself had shifted from internal will to external control. That reversal is critical. In power structures, control over movement often reflects control over status. Once movement is dictated entirely by others, sovereignty is effectively extinguished in practice, even if it still exists in memory, and Rome was deliberate about preserving that memory just in a transformed state. Because a captured queen was not meant to disappear. She was meant to remain visible in a reduced form. That visibility would later serve a purpose far beyond the battlefield. It would become evidence, proof that authority had existed, and proof that it could be stripped away completely. So by the time she was fully secured and removed from the battlefield, the transformation was already underway. She was no longer being treated as a reigning monarch. She was being prepared, silently and systematically, to exist as a symbol inside Roman power, a living representation of conquest already completed. Chapter 4, From Captive to Symbol, the first stage of transformation. What made this system so effective and so psychologically overwhelming was that Rome understood victory was not fully secured on the battlefield. It was secured in memory. And memory, in the Roman world, was shaped through public ritual, repetition, and spectacle. So after containment and observation, nothing about a high-ranking prisoner was left to chance. Every movement, every appearance, every moment of visibility was gradually adjusted toward one purpose: preparing the defeated ruler to exist as part of Roman storytelling. A queen who once stood at the center of a sovereign court was now slowly repositioned into a controlled narrative space. She was no longer treated as an active political subject. Instead, she became an anticipated, even someone whose eventual appearance would confirm the legitimacy of Roman victory. Even her silence during this stage was not neutral. It was interpreted, managed, and used to build tension for what was to come. Rome excelled at this kind of psychological staging. High-value prisoners were not simply held, they were placed in conditions where their presence could be managed like a resource. Their visibility was controlled. Their movement was restricted not just for security, but for timing. Because in Roman thinking, premature visibility reduced impact, and impact was everything. This is why queens became uniquely powerful within this system of display. A defeated general could represent military victory, but a queen represented something deeper: political legitimacy, divine association, dynastic continuity. She embodied the idea that entire systems of authority could be reduced to a single, controllable figure. That symbolism was far more valuable than any treasure or territory, and Rome understood how to amplify that symbolism. News of captured rulers would spread long before any public appearance. Cities would begin to anticipate it. Crowds would gather not just to witness a procession, but to witness confirmation that Rome's dominance extended beyond armies into the realm of kingship itself. The anticipation itself became part of the spectacle. The prisoner's absence before the event made her eventual appearance more powerful, but all of this preparation was only leading toward the final mechanism of Roman psychological warfare, the triumph. Unlike ordinary celebrations, a triumph was not simply about honoring a general. It was about converting conquest into permanent public memory. The city itself became a stage. Streets were arranged, rituals were structured, order replaced chaos so that domination could be displayed as harmony. And within that carefully constructed spectacle, captured rulers, especially queens, occupied a central symbolic position. They were not present as individuals in the way they once were. They were present as evidence. Evidence that resistance had existed, evidence that it had been overcome, and evidence that Rome now controlled even the highest forms of earthly authority. In that transformation, something final occurred that no battlefield moment could achieve on its own. A living queen was no longer just a prisoner of war. She became part of Rome's public memory of itself, a memory built not on destruction, but on display. A captured queen's journey was not over when the battle ended. It was just beginning. Because in Rome, defeat was not an event. It was a performance, and soon, she would be placed at the center of it. walking through streets filled with thousands of cheering Romans, not as a ruler, not as a prisoner, but as something Rome had perfected better than any empire before it, a living warning. Chapter 5. The Triumph, where empire became a show. What made the Roman triumph so psychologically powerful was that it did not feel like a military report. It felt like a living argument that Rome was presenting to its own people. It was not saying we won, it was saying, look at what happens when you oppose us. And that message was delivered not through words, but through carefully arranged images moving through the heart of the city. The procession itself was structured like a narrative. At the front came order soldiers, banners, and symbols of Roman discipline. Then came the spoils of war gold, weapons, captured artifacts, things that once belonged to foreign powers. Then came representations of conquered cities and defeated armies. Everything was arranged to escalate meaning step by step, building toward the most emotionally charged point of the entire event, the presence of living prisoners. This is where captured rulers became central to the spectacle, because nothing communicated the collapse of sovereignty more clearly than seeing a figure who once embodied authority now reduced to a controlled position within a public procession. Their presence was not incidental, it was essential. They represented the final proof that Rome had not only defeated armies, but had absorbed entire systems of rule. For the Roman audience, this was not just entertainment, it was reinforcement, a collective experience of certainty. People did not come only to watch, they came to confirm their understanding of power. The triumph gave them a visual language for empire. Rome at the center, everything else arranged beneath it in a hierarchy that was no longer theoretical but visible. And within that visual system, emotion was carefully managed. Captured enemies were not presented as chaotic threats or raging captives. They were controlled, contained, and integrated into the rhythm of the procession. This restraint was important. If they appeared too violent or too defiant, the message could shift toward instability. But if they appeared subdued, the message became one of total control. That is why queens, when included, carried such extraordinary symbolic weight. They were not just political figures, they were representations of legitimacy itself. A queen in procession was not simply a prisoner, it was a signal that even the highest forms of inherited authority could be brought into Roman order and made visible under Roman terms. It transformed abstract conquest into something the crowd could emotionally process, not just land taken, but power redefined. And this is where the psychological effect becomes most complete. Because once people witness power displayed in this way, it begins to shape what they believe is possible. Rome was not just showing victory over others, it was shaping imagination. It was teaching its population that dominance was structured, predictable, and absolute when exercised by the state. At the same time, it was sending a message outward to the world beyond Rome's walls. Resistance does not disappear in silence, it reappears in procession, stripped of authority and placed on display. So the triumph was never just about celebrating the past, it was about controlling the future. Because in the Roman mind, a victory was only fully complete when it had been turned into something the entire world could see, remember, and fear. Chapter 6. The streets of Rome become a stage. The triumph route was not random, it was symbolic. The procession moved through the most politically significant spaces in Rome, the outskirts where armies gathered, the forum where laws were debated, and finally toward the Capitoline Hill, the center of Roman religious authority. Every step was deliberate, every pause was calculated, and every visual element had meaning. At the front of the procession came musicians, drums echoed through narrow streets, smoke from incense filled the air, then came wagons carrying gold, weapons, captured treasures, and artwork stolen from conquered cities. Paintings showed burning cities, models displayed destroyed fortresses, maps highlighted newly conquered lands. The message was clear: this is what Rome has taken. But then the tone shifted, because after the spoils came something far more important: the human evidence, prisoners of war, and among them, the most valuable of all, captured rulers. A queen walking in this procession was not simply a prisoner, she was a contradiction made visible. She still carried herself with the memory of authority, but her body moved under Roman control. She was a live proof that status meant nothing in defeat, and that contradiction is what made the spectacle so powerful, because every spectator understood, if this can happen to her, it can happen to anyone. Chapter 7: Captive Queens in the Procession. When a queen was placed into a triumph, she was positioned carefully, not at the back, not hidden, but near the front of the prisoner column, because Rome wanted her seen clearly. Her identity was not erased, it was emphasized. Royal garments were often left intact. Jewelry sometimes remained on her body. Even crowns, if still present, were not always removed. But everything had changed meaning. A crown no longer represented authority. It represented loss. Jewels no longer symbolized wealth. They symbolized possession. And chains, when used, were not always simple iron restraints. In some cases, they were ceremonial, heavy, deliberately visible, sometimes even made of precious metals, not to comfort the prisoner, but to amplify symbolism, because nothing communicated Roman power more effectively than this: a queen who once ruled kingdoms now walking under guard in the capital of the empire that destroyed her authority. And the crowd did not remain silent. They reacted constantly, cheering, jeering, shouting names, reacting emotionally to every detail. The atmosphere was not calm, it was electric, because this was not just history being witnessed, it was history being reinforced. Chapter 8: Psychology of Humiliation. Modern audiences often misunderstand Roman triumphs as simple celebrations, but in reality they were psychological conditioning events. Rome was training its citizens, not militarily, but emotionally. Each triumph reinforced three core beliefs: Rome cannot be defeated, resistance is pointless, conquest is natural order, and captured. Queens were central to this messaging because they represented the highest possible fall. If a queen could be reduced to a prisoner, then no one was safe. But what made this system even more powerful was the uncertainty. Prisoners in the procession did not know their final fate. Some would survive, some would be imprisoned, some would be executed immediately afterward. This uncertainty created psychological tension not only for the captives, but for the audience, because the crowd was witnessing not just defeat, but potential death, and that unpredictability amplified emotional intensity. Every step forward could be the last, every turn in the procession could lead to execution, and that tension made the triumph unforgettable. Chapter 9: Zenobia enters Rome among all recorded captive queens. Zenobia of Palmyra remains the most famous example of Roman triumphal display. Her story did not begin in defeat, it began in power. Zenobia ruled Palmyra, a wealthy desert kingdom that controlled trade routes connecting the Roman East. She was not a symbolic ruler, she was a strategic one. Under her leadership, Palmyra expanded rapidly, taking control of Egypt and large parts of Asia Minor. For a brief period, Rome did not dominate the East, Zenobia did. That made her captures more than a military event. It became a political statement. When Emperor Aurelian defeated her forces, he did not simply capture a queen, he captured a rival empire's identity, and when Zenobia was brought to Rome for the triumph, the entire empire understood the significance. This was not a minor prisoner. This was a ruler who had once challenged Rome itself. Descriptions of her appearance in the procession emphasize one key detail repeatedly: her composure. Despite chains, exhaustion, and public exposure, Zenobia did not collapse. She did not break into visible despair. She did not lose posture or awareness. And this mattered deeply in Roman perception, because Roman psychological dominance depended not just on captivity, but on visible submission. A broken prisoner confirmed Roman superiority, but an unbroken prisoner complicated it. Still, the system prevailed. Zenobia was displayed as planned, and over time her identity was absorbed into Roman political memory, not erased, but controlled, a reminder that Rome could even contain those who once ruled in opposition. Chapter 10. What the crowd really saw to modern eyes, a triumph may seem like spectacle, but to Roman citizens it was emotional education. Children saw it and learned hierarchy. Soldiers saw it and learned legitimacy. Elites saw it and reinforced political loyalty. And everyone saw one consistent message: Rome always wins. Captured queens were central to this message because they represented the highest possible contrast, from divine-like authority to controlled vulnerability. The transformation was the lesson, not the individual. Because Rome did not just want people to witness conquest, it wanted them to internalize it, and that is why these events were staged so carefully, because memory was Rome's most durable weapon. But triumph was not the end of the story. For some prisoners, it was only the beginning of something far darker, because after the streets fell silent, after the cheering ended, after the procession reached its final destination, there was another place waiting beneath Rome, a place where the empire dealt with its enemies quietly, without crowds, without spectacle, without mercy, and that is where the fate of many captured rulers was decided. Chapter 11. When the triumph ends, the silence begins. The Roman triumph did not end with applause. It ended with silence. After hours of marching through Rome's streets, after gold, prisoners, and captured queens had been displayed to thousands, the procession slowly reached its final destination, the Capitoline Hill. At the top stood the Temple of Jupiter, symbol of Roman divine authority. Here, the victorious general would offer sacrifices. Here, Rome would declare that the gods themselves had approved the conquest. But while celebrations reached their peak above ground, something else was happening below, because not all prisoners were meant to remain visible. Some were quietly removed, taken away from the crowd, escorted down narrow ancient pathways carved into the stone of Rome itself, and led toward a place that functioned not as a prison in the modern sense, but as an ending. Chapter 12. The Mamertine Prison. Rome's final doorway beneath the streets of Rome lay one of its most feared structures, the Mamertine Prison. Known in ancient texts as the Tullianum, it was not designed for long-term imprisonment. It was designed for removal, for the final phase of Rome's justice system. The structure was carved directly into rock, dark and airless. It had 2 levels. The upper chamber was used for temporary holding, but the lower chamber was something far more disturbing. Accessible only through a hole in the floor, prisoners were lowered into it one by one. There were no windows, no light, no space for movement, only confinement and waiting. Above them, Rome continued to function normally. Markets opened, senators debated laws, citizens celebrated victories, but below, enemies of the empire were slowly erased from history. This was Rome's final contradiction, a civilization that celebrated conquest in public and hid its consequences underground, and for captured rulers this was where their story often ended, not in battle, not in rebellion, but in silence. Chapter 13, the final fate of captured rulers. Once a prisoner entered the lower chamber of the Tullianum, their fate depended entirely on political decision. Some were executed immediately, others were left to die over time, others were held briefly as political tools before being removed permanently. There was no universal method, only controlled endings. Ancient historians describe several famous examples. Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader who unified tribes against Julius Caesar, was held for years after his defeat. He was not immediately killed. Instead, he was preserved as a symbol until Caesar needed him. When Caesar's triumph came, Vercingetorix was paraded through Rome. Once the spectacle ended, he was executed. His story shows Rome's strategy clearly. Even death was scheduled for maximum political effect. Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, suffered a different fate. Ancient accounts describe him being lowered into the prison's depths after his triumph. There he reportedly descended into madness. Deprived of food and light, he died slowly, not as a warrior, not as a king, but as a forgotten prisoner beneath the empire that defeated him. Simon Bar Giora, a leader of the Jewish revolt, was displayed in Titus's triumph. After the procession, he was executed shortly afterward. His death marked the official closure of a war that had shaken Rome itself. Each of these cases followed a pattern: capture to display to disposal, not random, not emotional, systematic. Chapter 14, and what of captured queens? Queens followed a more complex path than male rulers because Rome understood something important. Power does not always need to be destroyed. Sometimes it needs to be controlled. A king could be executed and forgotten, but a queen carried something deeper than authority. She carried legacy. She carried continuity. She carried the memory of a system that once existed, and that made her dangerous, even in defeat. This is why Rome did not treat captured queens as simple prisoners. They were studied, observed, measured, not for who they were in the past, but for what they could become inside the empire. Some were broken deliberately, removed from visibility, erased quietly so no story could grow around them, but others were preserved, not out of mercy, but out of strategy, because a living queen inside Roman control created a different kind of message. Even power can be contained, and containment was more impressive than destruction, because destruction is temporary, but control is permanent. The second life of a defeated queen after the triumph, when the crowds disappeared and the streets returned to normal, a new phase began, one that was invisible, quiet, but deeply calculated. Captured queens who were not executed entered a controlled existence. They were relocated, often far from their home land, placed in environments where everything around them was Roman. Language, customs, law, even time itself felt different, because in Rome, time moved according to empire, not memory. This was not imprisonment in chains, but it was still confinement, a softer kind, a more sophisticated one, because physical chains can be resisted, but environment reshapes identity slowly. A queen who once ruled over her own people now had to exist in a space where nothing responded to her authority. No court, no advisors, no army, no throne, only observation and limitation. Over time, something subtle begins to happen. Not destruction, not collapse, but adaptation. Because humans adapt, even rulers, even queens, and Rome relied on that. Why Rome kept some queens alive. It was not kindness, it was utility. A living queen could serve multiple purposes at once. She could be shown privately to visiting diplomats, a quiet reminder of what happens to resistance. She could be used in negotiations, a bargaining piece that still held symbolic value. She could be integrated into Roman society, not as a ruler, but as proof that Rome absorbs everything. And most importantly, she could exist as a long-term warning, because stories fade, but living reminders do not. Every time someone saw her, they were not just seeing a person, they were seeing a message. This is what defeat looks like after the noise ends. The invisible transformation. The most unsettling part of this process is that it was not forced in obvious ways. There were no constant punishments, no visible cruelty. Instead, there was structure, routine, expectation, a controlled life where choices were limited but not entirely removed. This created a psychological shift, because when control is absolute, resistance becomes meaningless. And when resistance becomes meaningless, identity begins to change, not suddenly, but gradually. A queen does not wake up one day and accept defeat, but over time, she stops expecting change. She stops waiting for restoration. She begins to live within the system that replaced her own, and that is where Rome truly succeeded, not in capturing the body, but in redefining the mind. Chapter 15, The Psychology of Empire. To modern readers, Roman practices often appear brutal, but brutality alone does not explain empire. Control does. Precision does. Understanding human behavior does. Rome was not powerful just because it conquered land. It was powerful because it understood perception. It understood that people do not just react to force, they react to meaning, and Rome controlled meaning better than almost any empire in history. 3 layers of Roman control. Every captured ruler existed within a 3-layer system. 1. Physical control. The body is secured, movement is restricted, escape is eliminated. This is the most basic level, but also the least important in the long term. 2. Social control. The environment is replaced. The ruler is removed from their people, from their culture, from their support system. This isolates identity, because identity needs reinforcement to survive. 3. Psychological control. This is where Rome became unmatched. The ruler begins to understand nothing they do will change their position. No action leads to restoration. No resistance leads to victory. And once that realization sets in, control becomes internal, not external. Why this system worked? Because it removed hope without needing constant force. A person who still believes they can regain power will resist, but a person who understands that power is permanently gone becomes predictable, stable, contained, and that is what Rome wanted. Not chaos, not rebellion, but controlled existence. The role of memory. Rome did not just conquer in the present, it conquered the past. It reshaped how events would be remembered. A queen who once ruled a powerful kingdom would not be remembered as a rival. She would be remembered as a figure who was defeated, a ruler who was displayed, a symbol of Roman victory. This rewriting of memory ensured something critical. Future generations would not see her as inspiration, they would see her as warning. Chapter 16, The real cost of empire. Behind every triumph stood a hidden reality. Destroyed cities, displaced populations, broken political systems, and leaders who once shaped entire regions reduced to controlled symbols. But the real cost of empire was not just physical, it was conceptual. Because Rome did not just take land, it took meaning. What was lost when a kingdom fell? The loss was not just territory, it was language losing influence, traditions losing authority, beliefs losing relevance, systems losing legitimacy, and at the center of all that loss was the ruler, because rulers represent continuity, and when they are removed, continuity breaks. What was replaced? Rome did not leave empty space behind. It replaced everything: new laws, new governance, new identity, and most importantly, a new understanding of power. Power was no longer something inherited, it was something granted by Rome. Why reversal was impossible? Because Rome's system did not allow for return. A captured queen could survive. She could adapt. She could even live comfortably. But she could never reclaim what she once was, because her authority did not exist anymore. Not physically, not legally, not socially. And once all three layers are gone, power cannot be rebuilt. But the deeper truth is even more unsettling, because reversal was not just impossible in practice, it was made impossible in perception, and perception is where power truly lives. The erasure of possibility for a queen to return to power, one thing must exist: belief. Belief among her people that she still matters. Belief among allies that she can still lead. Belief within herself that restoration is possible. Rome removed all three, not through destruction alone, but through demonstration. The triumph was not just a celebration, it was a broadcast, a message sent across regions, cultures, and future generations. She has already been defeated. And once that image spreads, return becomes more than difficult. It becomes unimaginable, because people do not rally behind what they believe is already finished. The breaking of connection. A ruler without people is not a ruler, and Rome understood that separation is more powerful than execution, because execution creates martyrs, but separation creates silence. A queen taken far from her homeland loses more than territory. She loses contact, no messages, no direct influence, no ability to shape events. Even if her people still remembered her, they could not reach her, and over time, memory without presence begins to fade, not suddenly, but slowly, like a voice becoming distant, until eventually it becomes history. The replacement of structure. Power does not exist in isolation. It exists inside systems, courts, armies, advisors, laws, traditions. Rome did not just remove the queen, it replaced the entire structure around her. New governors were installed, new laws enforced, new loyalties formed, and most importantly, new generations grew up knowing only Roman authority. This is where reversal truly collapses, because even if the queen returned, there would be nothing left to return to. No system that recognizes her, no structure that supports her, no foundation to rebuild from. The control of narrative history is not just recorded, it is shaped, and Rome shaped it deliberately. A defeated queen was not remembered as a temporary loss. She was remembered as a completed story, a closed chapter, something that had already reached its end. This matters more than it seems, because when a story feels finished, no one expects a continuation, and without expectation, there is no preparation for return. The transformation of identity. Perhaps the most irreversible change happened within the queen herself, because identity is not fixed. It responds to environment, to feedback, to reality. A queen who once gave orders and saw them carried out, now gives none and sees nothing change. Over time, this alters perception, not just of the world, but of self. She may remember who she was, but memory alone is not power. Power requires reinforcement, and in Roman control, there was none. No one addressed her as ruler, no one acted on her authority, no one treated her as sovereign, and slowly, the gap between who she was and what she is becomes impossible to ignore. The final lock, time. Time is Rome's most underestimated weapon, because even if everything else failed, time would finish the process. Years pass, then more years, allies move on, enemies disappear, new leaders rise, new systems stabilize, and the world adapts, because the world always adapts. By the time enough time has passed, the idea of reversal no longer feels realistic. It feels irrelevant. And that is the final stage, not when return is impossible, but when it no longer matters. The illusion of survival from the outside, it may look like survival. A queen lives, she breathes, she exists. But existence is not restoration, because what was taken was not just life, it was position, authority, meaning, and those things cannot be returned once removed from every system that supports them. Rome's true victory. This is where Rome's victory becomes complete, not when the battle is won, not when the city falls, not even when the triumph ends, but when reversal becomes unthinkable, when even the idea of return disappears from reality, because at that point, control no longer needs to be enforced. It sustains itself, and that is why a captured queen could live, but never return, because Rome did not just defeat her kingdom, it removed the world in which her power made sense. And without that world, power is not just lost, it becomes impossible. Because once power loses its environment, it cannot survive on memory alone. And even if the queen still remembers every command she once gave, there is no one left to hear it, no one left to respond, no system left to carry it forward, and in that silence, authority does not fight back. It fades, not dramatically, not violently, but quietly, until one day, it no longer exists anywhere except in history, and history does not give power back, because history does not move backward, it only records what has already been accepted, what has already been settled, what the world has already moved on from. And once something is accepted as finished, it stops being questioned, it stops being challenged, it stops being imagined as something that could ever return. A fallen queen does not just lose her throne, she loses relevance, because relevance exists in the present, and history lives in the past, and the distance between those two only grows with time. People begin to remember her differently, not as someone who could return, but as someone who once existed. Stories replace reality, narratives replace possibility, and slowly, the idea of her becomes more powerful than the person herself. But that power is not real. It cannot command. It cannot change anything. It can only be remembered. And memory is a controlled space, because memory can be shaped, retold, simplified, even altered. Rome understood this better than most, because once they controlled the story, they controlled the future of that story. A queen remembered as defeated will never be followed again. A queen remembered as fallen will never be feared again. This is the final transformation, not from ruler to prisoner, but from person to story, from authority to symbol, from presence to memory. And symbols do not act, they do not resist, they do not return. They exist only as reminders of something that is no longer possible. So even if she survives, even if she adapts, even if she lives out the rest of her life in controlled comfort, the truth does not change. She is no longer part of the world that creates power. She is part of the world that explains its loss. And that is why reversal does not just fail, it disappears. Because by the time history settles, there is nothing left to reverse. No structure, no belief, no system, no future that connects back to the past she once ruled. Only a story remains, and stories, no matter how powerful they sound, do not give power back. Chapter 17, What Survives After the Empire. Today, the Roman Empire no longer exists. Its legions are gone. Its emperors are dust. Its laws are fragments scattered across history. But its stories remain, not as simple tales of conquest, but as echoes of something far more calculated, and among those stories none are more powerful than those of captured rulers, because they reveal something deeper than military history. They reveal how power behaves when nothing stands above it, when there are no limits left, when victory is absolute. The aftermath. No one sees history often focuses on the moment of conquest, the battle, the triumph, the parade, the cheers, but those moments are only the surface, because the real story begins after the noise fades, after the crowds disappear, after the empire moves on to its next victory. What remains is silence, and inside that silence are the people who were transformed by it. Captured rulers did not simply vanish, they continued to exist, but not in the way history usually remembers. They lived in controlled spaces, in altered identities, in realities where their past no longer had power, and that is where the true impact of empire can be understood. Power was never about the crown. A crown looks powerful, a throne feels permanent. But Rome proved something unsettling. Power is not in the symbol, it is in the system that supports it. Remove the system, and the symbol becomes empty. A queen without her kingdom is no longer untouchable. A ruler without recognition is no longer absolute. And a throne without people is just a chair. This is why Rome did not fear crowns. It dismantled what made them meaningful. The transformation into memory. Captured queens did not just lose their power, they were transformed into something else entirely. They became memory, but not the kind of memory they would have chosen. Not stories of resistance, not legends of survival, but controlled narratives, shaped by Rome, presented by Rome, remembered through Rome. Their identities were rewritten, not erased, but redirected, because a completely erased enemy teaches nothing, but a visible, defeated one teaches everything. A warning disguised as a story to the Roman people. These stories were not tragedies. They were proof. Proof that resistance ends. Proof that power can be taken. Proof that even the highest rulers can fall. But to those who looked deeper, they were something else. They were warnings, not loud ones, not obvious ones, but quiet, persistent reminders of a simple truth. No position is permanent, no authority is absolute, and no power exists without support. What history chooses to remember, time has a way of simplifying everything. Complex events become short narratives, nuanced lives become single labels, and powerful figures become symbols. A queen who once ruled thousands becomes a single paragraph, a single moment, a single outcome, defeat. But that simplicity hides something important, because behind every defeated ruler was a complete world that once existed, a system, a culture, a belief structure, all reduced to a conclusion, and that is the final transformation of power, from reality to story, the illusion of permanence. Rome appeared eternal, unshakable, absolute. But history tells a different story, because even the empire that controlled everything eventually disappeared, which raises a question: if Rome itself did not last, then what truly survives? Not the buildings, not the armies, not even the rulers. What survives is the pattern, the method, the understanding of how power operates. The pattern that never disappears. Empires change, names change, borders change, but the underlying system remains familiar. Control perception, control narrative, control memory, and you control how history is understood. Rome mastered this, and that mastery outlived the empire itself. because every system of power that followed learned in some way from the same principle. The final truth of Roman conquest: Rome's triumphs were not just celebrations, they were messages, carefully constructed, deliberately displayed, and permanently remembered. Captured queens stood at the center of those messages, not because they were weak, but because they were powerful enough to matter when they fell. Their fall carried meaning, their presence carried warning, their existence carried proof that no one was beyond reach. And what remains today, we do not see the chains, we do not see the triumphs, we do not see the controlled lives that followed, but we still see the stories, and those stories still carry the same weight, because they are not just about Rome, they are about power itself, how it rises, how it controls, how it reshapes reality, and how it ensures that even in victory, it continues to exist beyond its own lifetime. The ending, unchanged feel, just deeper impact. A crown is only powerful while it is respected. A throne is only real while it is defended. And a queen is only untouchable until the moment her kingdom falls. After that moment, everything changes, not just for her, but for history itself. Rome's triumphs were not just celebrations, they were warnings written in human form. Captured queens stood at the center of those warnings, not because they were weak, but because they were powerful enough to matter when they fell. And that is the final truth of Roman conquest. It did not erase its enemies. It transformed them into lessons. Lessons carried through streets. Lessons carved into memory. Lessons that survived long after the empire itself disappeared. Because in the end, Rome understood something timeless. Empires do not live through armies. They live through stories. And the story of the chained queen was one of its most powerful ever told.